All right. Thank you all for coming today. I'm really happy to see so many people trying to learn about building desktop applications with JavaScript. So obviously, as the title is here, we're going to be building desktop applications with JavaScript, but specifically a framework called Electron. And so I want to talk to you quickly about what I'd like you to walk away with the talk from. So I want to give you kind of an idea of what types of apps exist and how they work. So there's a lot of different types of applications, and the word app gets thrown around a lot. So I want to quickly kind of single down on each of those and so you have a better idea of what they are. And then I want to have an understanding of what Electron actually is, the reason people use it, and the reason people might not use it, and then a general idea of how Electron applications are made. So before we do all of that, I'm just going to introduce myself really quickly. So I'm a student at Code Chrysalis, making a lot of full-stack applications. That's generally with like Node.js and JavaScript and React. And I'm very determined to make apps with as little effort as possible. So that'll make a little bit more sense later. I don't want to rewrite code a lot. I want to make one application, and I don't want to have to keep rewriting it for different platforms. And that's kind of where Electron will come in. So we're starting very low level. It'll ramp up a little bit, but we just want to start with a baseline of what an application actually is. So it's a type of software that allows you to perform specific tasks. So very simple. But there's lots of different types, and we want to kind of remember, people just throw around the word app, but there's different types. So there's a mobile application, a web application, and a desktop application are kind of the three main types. So if we're going to jump into kind of what those are, why they're created, and how they're created, we'll have a better understanding of why Electron is so cool. So a mobile application, how does it be made? Generally, you're using a very specific software for a very specific platform. So for an iOS app, you're going to be using Xcode and Swift. And for an Android app, you're using something like Java and Android Studio. So it's a very specific set of things. And then why do people make a mobile application as opposed to something like a desktop application? So it's got a really nice native feel. Like when you're opening the phone, it feels very nice. It looks very nice. It's very easy to use. It has access to a huge market, so you're able to basically show it to anyone who looks at the App Store, which is pretty cool. And then obviously it's the same idea. It's great visibility, so everyone can see it. But what about a web application? So a web application is really cool because it's just code that's served on the internet. So if you can connect to the internet, you can look at a web application. And those are generally made with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so why would we want to make a web application as opposed to something like a desktop application? Well, you can write the app once and it goes everywhere. Like I said, if you can access the internet, you can access a web application. So that's really easy access. It's got a very easy updating system, so you can basically just fix your code and it goes to the server and gets updated automatically. So you don't have to install anything at all when you're just accessing a web application. So to the main point of the talk, why would we ever build a desktop application if web applications and mobile applications have so many good points? But we also want to think about how they're made, because there's a lot of pluses to desktop applications, but it's not so easy generally. Usually you have to use a very specific framework for a very specific platform. It's similar to a mobile application in that sense. So for Windows, you're generally using C++ and C# with a specific framework. So if you don't know either of these languages, you have to go learn that whole thing, and then you have to learn the entire framework as well, just to be able to make an application for Windows only. And then for Mac, you generally will have to learn something like Swift and Xcode again to make the application for Mac. Or as we're going to get into, you can use Electron. But why do people actually make these? There's a lot of processes that you have to go just to get to that endpoint. But these are kind of the three main points that I've seen for why people actually make desktop applications. So you can access something called low-level system APIs. And what that means is you're able to access everything on your computer super easily. So obviously when you're using your computer, you can access your files, and that's what a desktop application can let you do. You can access everything in the computer really easily, which is something web applications can't quite do. It's fully functional offline, so a web application, you obviously need to be connected to the internet, but a desktop application, you just download it once and you can use it at any time. And then the other idea is you can fully access your hardware. So you'll notice that like a video editing software, or like something that's going to be compiling really difficult and big code, you can't do that on a web application. You need to actually have something in your computer that can access all of the components inside your computer to actually make use of them. So yeah, that's kind of the general idea for desktop applications. But how do we get both? So we want to be able to not learn a bunch of different frameworks. We don't have to learn all this different stuff. But we also want to be able to have the cool parts of a desktop application where we can access all of those components. And that's actually where Electron comes in. But what actually is Electron? It's magic. Not really, but it's a framework that allows you to use JavaScript, HTML, and CSS to build a desktop application. So as we were talking about, when you build a web application, if you know JavaScript, if you know HTML, if you know CSS, you can make that. But if you want to go into a desktop application, you're actually having to go back and learn all those frameworks, learn those different languages, use the specific software. But what Electron is letting you do is it's letting you go inside the computer, access all the components, make your windows, and actually make everything like a normal desktop application. But the actual visual part of that is just CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. So it's actually just web pages inside a native application, which is really cool. So here's what it's doing though. So that's actually, I'm going to quickly talk about how it works. So you have two main processes within Electron. You have a main process and you have a rendering process. So the main process is the kind of desktop application part. This is where it goes in, it's able to access all of your components, it can make windows, and it can access your file system, and then that's like the native desktop application part, which is important for all the points I mentioned earlier. But then you have a rendering process, which is where the kind of web pages come in. So you can tell Electron, hey, I'm going to be making a rendering process, which means, hey, I'm going to be making a small web page. And then here, if you know JavaScript, you can just create a small website or a web application, and throw that into the window. And from there, you've got your application. That's all it actually takes. But we were talking about all these, like, oh, JavaScript, but why is that actually a good thing? Why is that something that is a good point about Electron? It's how websites are made. So there are a lot of websites, obviously. Which also means there's a lot of people who know how to use HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So if you look on like Stack Overflow, the top two used languages are actually JavaScript and HTML and CSS. So the fact that you can actually use JavaScript to make a native application is pretty big, because that means anybody who can make a website can just spend a little bit of time to learn Electron, and now they're actually able to make desktop applications too, which is pretty cool. But that also brings us to the point of why would we use Electron specifically. So we know JavaScript is good, but we want to know, is the Electron framework actually worth using? Is there actually enough good points about it to make it worth it? So here are a few reasons for using Electron itself. So I've already kind of talked about, if you know JavaScript is really easy to get using. You're also able to use things like React. So if you have someone who's basically using a lot of front-end frameworks and is really comfortable with that, they can start making really cool, complex applications just because they've learned how to quickly use the Electron framework. Another really cool point of Electron is that you can make cross-compatible apps. So we talked about, if you're going to make a Windows application, you have to jump in, learn this framework, learn this new language, learn this new software. But if you use Electron, since they're just making websites, web pages inside of your page or inside of your application, you don't have to worry about like, is this going to be compatible with the Windows part or the Mac part? You're actually able to put everything inside it and just give someone a download link, and then they can use it on a Mac or Windows. So that you basically just doubled your users by just using Electron. And then the last point is it's really quick to build and get downloadable links. So this is kind of self-explanatory. You can build all the code into a downloadable file, and then you can send that to someone, and it's really quick, it's really easy, and it's really quick to get everyone access to your application. So it's really cool. And obviously everybody's using it, so it must be good. I don't know if that's the best advice, but a lot of big companies like Slack or Discord or Microsoft uses it for something like Skype. These are actually all made in Electron. So there's a lot of applications out there that you see that are built with Electron. So it has to be decent enough if these kind of big companies are using it as well, if I haven't convinced you yet. So this is just kind of a demo of VS Code, which is a code interpreter basically. So you're able to write all your code in there, and it's got a lot of different functionality. You can access all your files here that you've got, which is another point of the desktop application. You can render images, you can do all sorts of cool stuff with it, and this is all made in Electron. This is another one called Discord, where you're able to have voice calls and video calls with your friends. You're able to implement all sorts of cool stuff, and it's all built in Electron. So there's all sorts of cool stuff going on with Electron. So yeah, why would we want to talk about, I want to talk quickly about why we would use Electron versus another framework. So, and also just give you an idea of what other frameworks are out there if you're not so convinced with Electron yet. So for Windows, these are the three main frameworks that we see. WPF, UWP, and WinForms. So these are generally the most used frameworks for Windows desktop application development. There's a lot of cool parts of these. For example, UWP, you're able to make an application for all Windows devices, and it's quite easy to use in that way, so that's nice. But there's a really steep learning curve, which is one of the main points why I talked about how Electron is nice because it's accessible for a lot of people. If you want to make a desktop application, you need to learn a lot of different things just to use UWP, and let alone the language C++ if you don't know it yet. The other one for Mac, the main one is Cocoa that we've seen. This is used with Xcode, which is another Mac OS specific software. So you have to really, you have to go in, you have to learn the entire software, how it works, all of that infrastructure. And then you can use some other languages, which is nice, but the main one is generally Swift. And again, this is only for Mac. So you have to learn all of that stuff, and then you can make a Mac-only desktop application. And there's a couple other frameworks that are pretty similar to Electron, which are pretty nice. There's Hex and NW.js. They're also cross-platform, and they're a pretty similar concept. They both are using basically the idea of building web pages inside of an application, so it's cross-platform. It's pretty similar. You do have to compile it as opposed to Electron, which is interpreted. And then the learning curve is a little bit higher than Electron from what I've seen from trying to use the three of them. And there's a little bit less support for these two, where Electron right now generally is the largest framework and most supported framework for building desktop applications in JavaScript. So yeah, I want to jump into kind of a quick demo of how you would make a Electron application. So I'm going to keep this pretty simple, so if you don't know code, we'll have to kind of skip over a few things, but the general idea of what we're going to do is we're going to show you how to download Electron, set up the files. We're going to create a simple window in that main process, which I talked about before. We're going to create an HTML file to load it, and then we're going to run Electron to see the page itself. So, with that being said, we're going to set up a quick directory to have a simple Electron application going. So you're going to create an empty directory, and then you're going to use the command line yarn init, which if you're not familiar with, it just allows you to have a way to record all the dependencies or all the different types of software that you might be using. You're going to add Electron to that. You're going to create a JavaScript file, and then you're going to create a HTML file, and that's actually all you need to get started on a Electron application. So this is the package.json. If you're not familiar, again, this is just how you can store all of the other different types of libraries or frameworks that you want to use. So you can see inside of this, we have Electron added already by adding it like we added earlier. And then you just have a script to basically run the Electron command line code. And the first step of building an Electron application inside of the JavaScript file that we created earlier is you just need to create a window. And it's actually really, really easy with Electron. So you just grab a couple things from the framework. So you see we're grabbing the app component and the browser window component. We make a simple window variable, and then we have a function to create the window itself. So you can see that we're setting the window to be a new browser window. You set a width that you'd like, you set a height you would like, and then there's just a little bit of being able to use Node.js with that. And that's actually all you need to create a window. And then the next part of that is you're going to be loading a file. So we're going to, as I said, with the rendering process, we have to load a web page into it, which is just going to be generally a HTML page. So this is the code to do that. You have your window that we talked about before, and then we're loading the file, which will just be a simple index.html page. And then you have two other ideas in here of basically whenever they click on the icon, it will be ready and it will create that window for you. And whenever they're doing the closing function, it will be set to null, which will in turn close the window. And then this is what our HTML file will look like. It'll be quite simple. It'll just basically be a head and a body, and the body will have a hello world inside of it. So the classic, what is it called? Yeah, a classic application for a new coding language. And then the last two parts are just a couple specific things for Mac where you have to set the closing part to it. And then all we have to do is yarn start to, again, run that Electron command line code that we talked about earlier, and boom, this will come up on your computer. You will have a hello world inside of a window that we made. Obviously, it's very simple, but you can see that we basically just made a desktop application in like 2 minutes, which is pretty cool. So there's just a little bit of setup for creating a main window in that main process, and then you can make all sorts of different HTML pages and load them in as you'd like. And this was all done using JavaScript, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to show you what I made in 2 days with Electron. So it's not quite so polished, but it's just a very simple application. So you can see here I have a downloadable file that I created for my app called Habitify. And this was all created in React, actually. So it's just a very simple app. I'm not going to get into the actual functionality of it, but this is actually just basically a web page loaded into a native desktop application. You can see up here we can access all of these different parts to it, which is standard for a desktop application. And then it's got some little functionality where you can enter a habit that you'd like to track. So you can say like brush your hair, which I don't do enough. And you can set a time like, hey, notify me at 12 a.m. I don't know why you brush your hair at 12 a.m. And then you add the habit, you save it, and then you've got basically a reminder will come up at this time to say, hey, don't forget to brush your hair at midnight. And then we're back. So that was something I made in 2 days. It's really, really simple, but you can see how quick and easy it is to basically build an entire desktop application, which is something that people might think is a little bit difficult. You see, like Microsoft Word or iTunes, and there's this big complex application, and you think, oh, like I would never be able to do that. But if you can make a website, then you can make a desktop application with Electron, which is pretty powerful, I think. So I'm just going to quickly explain to you kind of how that application itself works. I'm not going to get too much into it, but again, I used React, so you're able to basically use any front-end framework, and you can have a single-page app that does all these different things. And then inside the main.js, remember when we rendered that HTML file, I'm just putting in another HTML page, and with React, you're just rendering a root main element. And then there's a outside library called Electron Builder, which all you have to do is install it, and then basically run, hey, yarn Electron build, and it builds an entire downloadable link that you can just send to your friends. So it's super, super quick, really easy, and it's pretty powerful, I think, in kind of creating applications. So before I conclude the talk, I want to talk a little bit about some of the negative points about Electron. So if you type Electron into Google, you'll get a lot of haters as well. With fair, like there's a fair reason for that, but I think I should probably address those reasons right now as well. So one thing is it takes up a lot of space, so people call it bulky or bloated, which is kind of true. If you make like a hello world, like simple application like that, it can take up a lot more space than you might think. So that's one of the negative points of Electron. Sometimes the files are really, really big. Another one is RAM usage. So if you open up 2 Electron apps, it can sometimes your computer will stop working because it's just it takes too much RAM. So there's a little bit of problems with that, but I think as I said before, things like VS Code and Skype and everything are using Electron. So it does have its points there, but I think because of all the points I've said earlier, there's enough of a reason to keep building Electron apps. One other thing is it can be hard to get a really native feel for Windows and Mac. So we've talked about, oh, there's this framework for Windows, oh, there's this framework for Mac. And when you build an application with those frameworks, it feels like it's built for that OS. So it's built for Windows, it's built for Mac. But Electron apps feel like they're Electron apps. It's its own little thing. It works well, it's smooth, but it doesn't necessarily feel like a native application. So that's one other thing, and also JavaScript. If you don't like JavaScript, which a lot of people don't, you might not want to use Electron because it's pretty much all built in JavaScript. So that's one of the main things people say, like, oh, JavaScript sucks, so I'm not going to use Electron, which is fair, I guess. But in conclusion, I want to say that Electron is still a really convenient way for web developers to create a desktop application. So I want everyone to remember that if you can build a website, then it's really easy for you to move into building kind of software. You can move to being a software developer as well. Obviously, it's not quite that easy, but I think you'll realize it's not that difficult to actually move a web application to a desktop app. After you spend a little bit of time learning the syntax for the Electron framework, you figure out, oh, I can make a window here, and then I can put my index or my HTML page in here. And it's pretty easy to actually migrate your files over to an Electron application, which again, you can have an offline application, which is pretty cool. And then just remember that there are drawbacks using Electron, but that hasn't stopped big companies like Skype or Slack from using Electron, which is pretty nice. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk and are maybe thinking about using Electron. You can find the actual code on my GitHub at Forbes C7. But thank you very much for listening.